Now is create some animated embers for this, and we're going to use a pattern to do this. And patterns are extremely useful. They're kind of akin to brushes, except they've got their own uses as well. Just as far as creation, they're quite similar. So to do this, I'm going to just create a new document. So File, New, and I'm going to make this fairly large. I'm going to make this about 2,000 pixels by about 2,000 pixels, and hit Create. There's my background, and unlike brushes where it takes basically anything white is going to be transparent, black is going to be visible, patterns are literal. Whatever is on that screen is going to be converted into a pattern. So this will also affect transparency. So I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to do this so that the background at the end is going to be transparent. But for now, I'm going to leave it as is. I'm going to go B for brush and go to my brush selectors here, or you can right click, and I'm going to go to, if you don't see this originally, go to special effects brushes, and we've got some splatter brushes, but you can really use anything you want. You can just use a round brush and create some particles. And let's just have a quick look at what these are. Let's select black for this, and some interesting little ones here. Let's try some other ones. And I might go with this one here, which is Kyle's Splatter Brush Pressure Control 02. I want the particles to be relatively small, but do adjust your brush size like so, and I'm just going to spread those out a little bit. That's probably a bit big. It's probably a bit big. So now, important thing to remember with when we're creating a pattern is that it's going to be a repeat of itself. So this square is then going to repeat on itself, upwards, downwards, left, right. Anything that's on the edge is going to be sheared off. So if you've got round shapes, you don't want to see that disappearing. So I'm just going to grab my eraser, E for erase, and I'm just going to get rid of anything towards the edge. The other thing is trying to avoid things that are obvious, repeats of the pattern. But experiment with this. You can always replace them later. So that's going to be just a bunch of little black specks on there, and I'm going to hide that background. So now we've got just the black specks with no background transparency. And then let's go to Edit and Define Pattern, and let's call this particles underscore 3, whatever you want to call it, and hit OK. Now that is now saved through as a pattern, so I can jump in here. Let's create a new layer. So I'm going to put this above, pretty much above everything, and there it is there. I'm going to call this particles or embers, and I'm going to right click and give it a color, red. So it's easily found here, and I'm going to fill this in with a color. I'm going to go G, grab my paint bucket, and I'm going to fill this in with something that won't necessarily fit, just a big green blob. It doesn't matter what color you use. And grab my move tool and V, and as you can see, it's just a big green rectangle. And that doesn't matter because I'm actually going to make that invisible. But let's add some particles to this via a pattern. So I'm going to go to my effects option and go to pattern overlay. Click it there. And in our pattern option, what you may see is something like that. Just see some of the default ones. But if you scroll down, so here's our pattern here. If you scroll down right to the bottom, at the very bottom will be the last pattern that you've created. Now the cool thing with this is we can scale this, so you can get the scale that you want. The smaller you scale it, the more you might start noticing the repeat. So you want to get something that's going to work for you as far as the scale and how it's going to repeat. Now I actually don't want these particles to be too big, so in this case I'm going for about 23, 24, 25, somewhere around there as far as the size goes, and hit OK for now. Now we've still got this green thing happening, and that's not going to be super cool for us, so I'm going to go to this fill option here. And what fill does is it allows you to change the transparency of your shape or your text or your layer and make that invisible, but it does 0 for the pattern. Now, as a counter to this, let's bring that fill up to 100. If we lower the opacity, it will lower the opacity of both, like so. So I want to keep my effect, so I'm just going to lower fill to 0. Cool. Now what we can actually do is we can actually animate these particles. So I'm going to go to the particles and I'm going to animate the style. I'm not going to animate the position, because if I animate the position, you can see it's going to be moved around as that, whatever that green shape was. So I'm going to actually animate the pattern for this. To do that, I'm going to, if that's where I want it to start, I'm going to start the stopwatch at the beginning, and then I'm going to move my timeline. Let's just move it to the end. I just want a slight bit of sort of ember movement, and then go to the pattern overlay and double click on it. And now with pattern overlay selected, I can actually move those up. And I don't want them moving up too much. I'm just going to have a slight sort of ember movement and hit OK. And then I can sort of see how that's going to animate. So even that's, it's some decent ember movement. It's only over 2 seconds. So I may even want to lessen that, but that's up to you. So I might want to jump in there and go, let's drop that down. It's going to be slightly less ember movement. Now of course you can add multiple movements to this, but important thing is to remember, do not move the shape. You need to double click on pattern, make sure you're on pattern overlay, then move that where that timeline is, and that will drop in that keyframe. You can see I've sort of got a little bit of a sway happening at that point. I'm actually going to delete that point. I just want this little subtle movement happening here. So next thing I want to do is I actually want to add some glow to these particles and get them looking a little bit more like embers than little black dots. Now we've got a problem with that. If I go to effects or layer styles and go to outer glow, and let's say we set our outer glow to normal and push that around, you won't actually see these dots glowing. And the reason for that is actually affecting the shape. So if I move this shape, what you'll see is now the shape has a glow to it, but not the embers, because the embers are currently a pattern. Likewise, if I add a color overlay, it's going to apply that color to my rectangle. So that's not going to work for me either. So I'm going to turn those off. I'm going to leave my pattern. And how are we going to do this? Well, what we're going to do is we're actually going to convert this to a smart object. So I'm going to right click and convert to smart object. And you'll notice this icon changes. It also loses the color I gave it, so you may want to bring that back just to red so we can identify it. It's still going to have the animation to it though. So there's our particles and there's our animation. And what we might want to do now is also add some glows or some colors to this. Now the really cool thing with smart objects is if you need to change anything, you can. You simply double click in the smart object thumbnail. It will then reopen as it was, as its own entity, and we have our particles. That's where they're animated, and you can rechange that. So if you needed to, you could double click on there and scale these up or change the animation, and as soon as you save that, Control S or Command S, it will transfer back to these particles here. So great thing with smart objects, really useful. But let's look at adding just some glows to these at the moment. So I'm going to go Effects and let's go to Outer Glow. There it is there. I've got it really high because of the demo, so I'm just going to drop the spread and the size down and have a play around with those. And you might also want to change the color. So I've got sort of an orange color for this at the moment, but you can push that around and get something that's going to work for you. You can go blue or whatever, but I'm going to try and keep it sort of in the orange spectrum here. You can also add a gradient to this as well and do some other really cool things, but do have a play around with the spread and the size of that, and that's going to affect how they are going to glow. They've also got a blend mode to them. So if you change the blend mode, you can change it to something like overlay. You can see it's going to get a lot more of a subtle effect to it. If you go difference, it's going to have a very different effect based on the color. So do have a play around with these sort of things. I'm going to go with overlay. That kind of works for me. And then just play around with these and play around with the colors as well. So you just want to get something that's going to work for you. Even if you push it up to like the yellows, that can be something really cool. Um, this is where you really get lost in the subtleties, but let's keep going. The other thing I want to do is I want to add a color to this because these are just little black spots at the moment. So let's go to color overlay, and I've got blue selected here, which looks kind of cool. But let's change this out to maybe a bright orange as well. These little orange glowing embers, like so. And I think that's looking pretty cool. And hit OK once you're done, both for the color and for the layer style. And then we've got our little black dots are now become little glowing embers, and they've got a little bit of a little animation popping over the top of them as well. So that kind of works for us. We can do some other funky things with this. We could add some little motion blurs to them and stuff like that, and that could be quite useful. So do have a play around with the effects for that sort of thing. What I'm going to do after this is show you how to add a displacement map to this, and also have a look at maybe adding some little other little features, and then finally a vignette.